Hello, my name's Janine Kavanagh, and I'm very happy to talk to you today about some of the work we've been doing here in Liverpool, looking at fundamental flow regimes during dike propagation. And as somebody that often ends up working in the lab, I thought I'd start with a field image, just because this very much inspires all the work that we do in our lab. And so this is a photo of the eruption in Iceland earlier this August. And when we see this kind of activity at the surface, a lot of people are standing in awe, looking at the lava, looking at the gases coming out, the vent. But as somebody that works on volcanic plumbing systems, I'm wondering what's going on underneath. And so that's a big inspiration for my work. So we're looking at modeling dike propagation in analog experiments. And what we do is we fill a clear perspex tank with gelatin, which is an elastic, transparent solid. We then pump fluid into the base of that. And our fluid is basically representing the magma. And by carrying out experiments using passive tracer particles, which are either suspended in the injecting fluid or in the gelatin solid, we can basically track the movement of the solid and how it deforms, and also the fluid and how it moves. We basically use this information to sort of study the physical dynamics of magma moving through the Earth's crust. So here's an experiment that we carried out a few years ago, and this is where we injected water into gelatin. And what you're looking at here is the passive tracer particles being injected and recirculating inside this penny-shaped crack, which is formed inside the gelatin. And what we can do then is use a technique called particle image velocimetry, which basically looks at the position of those particles and how they've moved over time between different images in the experiment. And from this, it basically calculates a vector field, so shows the movement of the particles over time. And so this is then a simulation of the movement that was in that water dike experiment. And you can basically see here high velocities in the brighter colors, so in reds, and the low velocities in blues, or even no color if there's no movement at all. And you could see there basically a jet, a fluid-like jet, which is formed. I'll play it again for you. So you see this centralized rapid flowing jet, and then recirculation of the fluid around the margins of the dike as it grows. And as it reaches the surface, there's a bit of an instability that seems to develop in the jet. In our experiments, we then decided to have a look at some different fluids to explore different Reynolds numbers and see how that affected the flow structures that formed. And so this is an experiment where we used a cellar size, which is called HEC. And it's basically, it's a shear thinning fluid, but at very low strain rates, it behaves as a Newtonian fluid, which basically means that it's kind of like the same as water, but it's more viscous at low strain rates. And so it has very, very similar properties other than this higher viscosity. And so it enables us to look at different Reynolds numbers. And so this is an experiment where you can see the injection of that cellar size. And you can see that just by eye, you can already see that there are some very different flow patterns in there. So we did the same thing by applying our particle image velocimetry. And this is the flow map that we recorded. And so rather than that sort of quite centralized jet and quite a variety of different flow directions and intensities, you can see instead in this experiment, and I'll play the video again, it's actually much more broad. So the velocity is much more uniform. We don't have the jet-like feature. And so it's quite a different kind of patterns compared to the water dike. So to look at this a little bit more closely in terms of flow regimes, I had a look at the Reynolds number calculations for all these different experiments and used different ways of calculating this. So you might remember from the Reynolds number equation that it includes a velocity term. So the velocity can be gathered from the tip of the dike and how that's changing. That's something that is done in nature, for example, when intrusions are growing. They might look at the seismicity, which is assumed to be where the tip position of the dike is, and use that to calculate a rate. So that's a tip velocity on this diagram, and those are the empty circles. And then we've got the velocity from the PIV, and so that's basically showing the internal fluid velocity and how that motion is happening. And for all these different experiments, so I've just put 4 on there to give you an idea: the water ones, xanthan gums, and the silicides, which is HEC. In every case, if you use the dike tip velocity, so the movement of the vertical tip, you're always going to underestimate the Reynolds number that is calculated. And for one of the experiments, that was actually underestimated by 2 orders of magnitude. But the water dikes, they're always having a higher Reynolds number, and they are associated with this jet flow. And then the xanthan gum and the silicides, they all express this creeping flow kind of behavior. Another point is that the sort of transition from laminar to turbulent flow, that might be happening at much lower Reynolds numbers than is commonly thought for dikes. And that's because we can see that we don't have to have very high Reynolds numbers in our jet flow experiments in order to start to see that instability developing, which is what we're thinking about as being the transition from laminar to turbulent flow. And so then there's this final point, which is about Reynolds number calculations being underestimated. And this is quite important because, as I said, in nature, the dike tip velocity would be the velocity that would be used in these kind of calculations. However, the fluid within the dike could be moving much, much faster. And this has quite a large implication, therefore, on the flow regime that will be assumed to be happening inside the dike. Okay, so that's just some final points and conclusions. So we've completed the analog experiments to identify 2 new distinct flow regimes. So we have this jet flow regime and creeping flow. And whether or not it's in one of these regimes depends on the Reynolds number. So therefore that relates to the flow velocity, the dike thickness, the magma viscosity and density. And these different flow regimes are going to affect the signals of magma movement beneath the surface before eruption and during eruption. And so they're very important, therefore, for the geophysics, the geodesy, geochemistry, petrology, all the different kinds of signals that are used at the surface to understand how magma is moving.